Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Welcome to the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. I'm Tom Ricks, and this is another in a series called The Seven Sins of Silicon Valley. I am doing this series to expose the corruption, the malfeasance, and basically just bad actions of the tech culture in America in general. And today I'm going to talk about Uber and Lyft. There's a lot to talk about with both of these companies. Uber is by far the worst offender as far as I'm concerned, but my personal anecdotes with Lyft are far more interesting, so I'll be starting with those. But before I do, the primary reason that I'm doing both of these together is recently the bulk of the evil that they've done is pretty much the same. I think the biggest creepy thing they've both done recently is fight an initiative in California to treat their drivers as employees, right? Now, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not even partially trained as a lawyer, and I am partially trained in a number of different skills where I would consider myself a subject matter expert in certain things, but law is not one of them. But I do have garden variety common sense, and when I think of the term employee, right, it's, do I do a job that I get paid for that my boss can fire me, right? That's pretty self-explanatory, right? And by that definition, if I drive an Uber car or I drive a Lyft car, I am definitely a freaking employee, right? Now, there's this gray area called contractors, right, where, you know, if you, I had family members recently that made an upgrade to their house, right, and if you want to pay somebody to do something that is a project, right, it has a beginning, a middle, and an end, you know, they come into your house, they put up the plaster in the walls, they put in the plumbing and the wiring, and then you get the certification done, and then they're done, right? So that would be a really good example of what a contractor is supposed to do, at least in theory. So when you have a situation where the contract that you're supposed to be doing never ends, there are a lot of people in this country and around the world who say that that is not a contract and should not be a contract. That's just an attempt to get around the law. And the reason companies try and get around this law is because if you're an employee, you have certain protections, you have certain benefits. There's certain things that the company has to do, like pay for your Social Security and pay for your benefits and pay the government for what you do. Whereas if you're a contractor, theoretically, you're running your own company, or you have the option to run your own company. So why would you pay the Social Security tax for the carpenter or the plumber that comes in to do an upgrade on your house, right? But if you're, you know, so Uber and Lyft, like all the tech companies, or at least all the big ones, can afford very good lawyers. And in this case, they didn't even afford the lawyers because there was an initiative in California to count these, you know, to basically a citizens initiative. There were two competing ones, right? One said, if you're an employee and you work for California, you're gonna need to be an employee. And there was another one that said that no, these let's be honest, these employees of Uber and Lyft are not really employees. We want them to work for cheap and for free. And the two sneaky things that Uber and Lyft did in this case were, on the one hand, they basically scared all their drivers, saying, hey, you know, we're not going to be able to have as many drivers because if we have to pay all these things to you as employees, then, you know, we're just going to have to fold as a company, or at a minimum, we won't be able to hire as many of you and service is going to suffer. Meanwhile, I'm surprised to say this, but let's be honest, greedy inhabitants of California, they weren't talking about how, you know, these employees are going to get fired. They were basically saying your Lyft and Uber rides are going to get more expensive. And there are many people I know because I was, back when I was a contractor, between contracts, I did Lyft driving. And there are many people who utterly depend on Lyft or Uber to get around. So, of course, they're going to vote in their self-interest of if you're suddenly going to start charging them more money for an Uber or a Lyft drive, then they need to be able to get to their job, literally, because they can't afford to have a car. And so basically, normally I'm a huge proponent of democracy and a huge proponent of citizens' initiatives. But in this case, they basically did a form of legalized indenture. I can't go as far as saying it's legalized slavery, but to me, if you're an employee and you should have benefits as an employee, and the majority comes together and basically says, we like our cheap labor, and so this one particular subset of the population don't get the benefits of being an employee. That's a civil rights violation. And eventually, when I do another series, and I don't even know what I'm going to call that, on the Constitution and self-determination, I'm pretty radical as far as that's concerned. I'm very much a believer in the rights of the majority, and I'm very much a believer in the rights of self-determination. Almost every state, not everyone, but almost every statelet that wants to emancipate itself from the country at large, I'm a firm believer in. Scotland, Catalonia, Kosovo, all of these places, I believe, should be allowed to become their own sovereign countries if the inhabitants of that country vote to do so by a majority. Even including states. I actually believe that you know what, I could go down that rabbit hole, and this podcast is about Uber and Lyft. And suffice to say that basically both of these companies bamboozled the public at large into pretending that the drivers for them are not employees. But, at the end of the day, if Uber can fire me, if my livelihood, my rent is dependent on these companies, and for some people it is, they work for them 40, 50, 60 hours a week, and I get too many bad reviews from my customers, then I can be fired by Uber. Now, sometimes that's just a machine, which is actually worse than a person. And sometimes it can be an actual person, right? I get a phone call on my Uber complaint line, and a human being says, no, you're right, that could be potentially embarrassing for us. No, I'm sorry, person, you're done. We know this for a fact because there are all kinds of news stories about some Uber or Lyft driver doing something that's embarrassing for Uber and Lyft, and legitimately the company says we're not doing business with that person anymore. But what that really means is they've been fired by Uber and Lyft, right? If you're a contractor, then you should have a specific project that you are brought in to do, a work for hire scenario, not some indefinite, we have no idea when it's going to start, when it's going to end. That's crap. You're an employee, right? It is what it is. But at the end of the day, as much as I like the Western states, California clearly exhibited immature and basically evil behavior in this instance. But I think, so anyway, the other personal example, and I think far more interesting, I probably should have started with this, but to me, of all the things that I've interacted with in terms of tech companies, the most stupid example of how tech companies behave has been with Lyft, right? So earlier on I said that Facebook is the worst, and they're why I did this series. But at the same time, the best example of how stupid these tech companies can be, just how ignorant they are two examples of when I worked for Lyft. And I say I worked for it because, trust me, I have no desire to ever work for them again. Even if I become financially desperate, I'll get a job waiting tables before I get in a car and drive around for Lyft again. The first one is when I was truly desperate. and basically had car troubles. They have a what seems like a generous program that basically is in combination with one of the rental car companies that you can show up and get a rental car, and basically they will take the cost of the rental car out of your earnings, and if you drive enough, they'll give you a very discounted rate. And for somebody that has no car, this seems really generous, right? And there's some problems with this, right? The first one is that if anything at all, and I mean at all, the slightest scratch happens to this car, you're liable for it. Like, they can come after you. And but the bigger reason I'm using this as an example has nothing to do with Hertz itself. It has to do with what I had to go through to get into this program. So I show up at a designated location, and I'm one of like 30 people in the room, and we're sitting all there waiting in these chairs inside of an auto parts store. And the thing that struck me the most had nothing to do with how desperate the other people were around me. And they were clearly more desperate than I was. It was obvious based on the way they were waiting that their very livelihoods, their rent, the well-being of their families depended on their ability to get into this program. And when I finally got my turn, I'm seeing and bear in mind I'm there for like a couple of hours, so I'm able to see the interaction. And at this desk, right, they have a Lyft guy and they have a Hertz guy, right? The Lyft guy is doing most of the work, right? Because basically, right, to register for this program, you have to register through Lyft. You get what you sign up. They direct you to where you're supposed to go. And then, of course, you actually have to get the actual car from the insurance guy. And the thing is that the dynamic between the Lyft guy and the insurance guy was not good. And it was pretty obvious that the Lyft guy did not listen to the insurance guy. There were limits on the cars. There was a disconnect on what the status was. You know, the rental guys would flat out tell him, you know, we can't get that car for a couple of hours. And the Lyft guy would turn around and tell somebody waiting in line something totally opposite to that. The Lyft guy basically was exactly the human personification of exactly what I would expect from a tech company worker. If they weren't actually from Silicon Valley, they were clearly a guy who knew a guy who knew a guy. You know, he was a bro. He was very much a, you know, you're going to my way or the highway. You know, if you have a problem, go to the terminal and solve it. Don't talk to me. It was, you know, let's solve things through the algorithms. He seemed friendly, but he actually wasn't. It pretty much literally everything I've talked about in this series. The rental car guy was a blue collar, down to earth, tell it like it is, normal person. Right? If you've ever rented a car or gone to a store, right, they don't earn a lot, but they keep it real, right? As long as you're not disrespectful to them, they're there to do their job. They'll be polite to you, and there's no reason to mess around, right? I would not at all be surprised at all if there was a giant pay discrepancy between the guy that was working for Lyft and the guy that was working for the rental car company. I don't know. What I do know is that basically the complete lack of cooperation between the guy that worked for Lyft and the guy that worked for the rental car company was, like I said, to me, the most visible example of how rogue these tech companies are, how they don't respect any other segment of society. They don't respect their consumers. They don't respect us. And the government, because of how corrupt and locked it has gotten, both because of the Republican Party and even within the Democratic Party, of the half of the Democratic Party wanting to be corporate Democrats or civility Democrats or semantics Democrats, our society is broken down, and the people who have taken up that vacuum are the tech companies, all of them, right, including Uber and Lyft. There's the second example I can think of. I actually did not need to do this. I didn't need the money from Lyft, but Lyft came up with this program where they offered to let people drive to get a ride to and from the voting area for free. And I thought this was fantastic. And I had already voted. I voted early in that election. It was the 2018 election. And so what I did is I signed up for Lyft again, even though I didn't need to, and took the day off so that I could help bring people to the election. And I started really early and worked, I think, like 10 hours that day, a lot. I worked a lot that day, and I worked very late as long as the polls were still open. And I can tell you that of the, I would say 20 to 22 people that I took, and if I was still doing Lyft as a regular driver, it would have been a great day. I mean, I was busy all day because people were taking advantage of the fact that basically Lyft was offering free rides. But the thing is that they had no qualifier for what quantified as a free ride. Now, I've looked at some of their promotional materials because I still use Lyft and Uber because they're still very useful services. And I've looked at their promotional materials for things like this since then, like for the 2020 election, and they qualified a bit. But, let's be honest. We all know how stupid and smart these tech companies are. So it's probably not really a qualifier. And what I mean by that is during the whole freaking day that I literally took off to help these companies do a public service, only two of the people that were involved in this actually went to an actual election. That is kind of dumb, right? It's basically these companies getting a lot of money on free publicity for a service that doesn't actually do any public good. And to me, again, that's typical of the Silicon Valley culture, right? Oh, we're good public citizens, so we're going to help get out the vote. But, we're still going to allow, Facebook and Twitter and Google all agree to combat disinformation campaigns. Meanwhile, actual Nazis have groups that are totally fine, and Facebook, lets them run rampant in the name of free speech, but, Right Wing Watch and other leftist groups get taken down, and it takes a major outcry to get them to do anything, right? So I could end there very easily, but since I'm going to be doing a lot of things with these podcasts, I'm also considering a documentary, maybe even a book, but I'm starting with it. So for purposes of the record, as it were, Uber is by far a bigger offender than Lyft. In fact, for a very long time, we used Lyft exclusively, except for the little problem that, to be blunt, Lyft doesn't work as well as Uber, right? If I use Uber, a car shows up, I get in, it takes me where I want to go, and I go. If I use Lyft, they make their drivers use their in-house GPS system, which doesn't work very well. So very often you'll have a driver looping around for, an extra 15 minutes trying to find you. And when you actually finally get there, it'll take you in a weird, inefficient route. If there's like a blockade somewhere, they used to be able to use Waze or Google, and they could, work around it. Like they could have their own internal app take them around. But Lyft, for, I guess, liability reasons or whatever, basically doesn't work. It just doesn't, it doesn't work very well. And after the California thing, to me, morally speaking, there's very little difference between Uber and Lyft. Now, in terms of the overall history of these companies, that is clearly not the case, right? Lyft has problems, and those problems are pretty much endemic that all of the big tech companies have. Not just the big five, all of them. But Uber is if I was to make a list of the top 5 evil tech companies that I know of, Uber would probably be number 4, right? Because, you've got Facebook, you've got Twitter, you've got Amazon, and Uber is pretty high up there, right? Apple does some evil things, Microsoft has done some evil things, and still does some evil things, but compared to Uber, so the big problems with Uber are, initially, it was basically started by a rape bro, right? It was started by a sexist, disgusting jerk who had total control over the company, just like Mark Zuckerberg, but he literally had frat boys helping to run this thing. He had something called God Mode, where, he and his buddies would chuckle about a woman who went out to have sex, and then literally sit there and watch, probably while they're sitting around, drinking martinis or whatever frat bros drink, as she went home the next day, right? I mean, they literally had algorithms that helped them seek out and sense this kind of thing. They had rapes, and they still do have rapes in their cars, but they basically did nothing about this for many years early on. And it took a major public outcry before the companies that had invested heavily in Uber basically had an internal revolt and literally forced the old guy out with the new management. The new management is, not exactly sterling in their morality, given what we just saw in California, but they don't stand out as, as much as, say, Mark Zuckerberg or Jack at Twitter does in terms of malfeasance. And then the other thing that Uber did that just kind of puts them in a wholly different category of evil than Lyft is they're thieves, right? Supposedly, self-driving cars are like this big thing and are going to put a lot of taxi drivers and a lot of truck drivers out of work, right? Nobody liked taxis, or at least very few people did. They smelled. They were corrupt. They were inefficient. There's a reason why Lyft and Uber were as successful as they were. And if you're a minority, you can't get a taxi ride because each individual taxi driver can just decide if they're going to pick you up or not, right? With Lyft and Uber, you just push a button and you're picked up, right? A Lyft driver or an Uber driver can't decide not to pick you up because it affects their rating. And that's an improvement. But what's not an improvement is that the truck drivers, which are like one of the few decent blue-collar jobs that anybody who doesn't have a lot of education can still do in this country, they want to replace with robots. And, you look at Amazon, which is trying to automate as much of its workforce as it can, and just how evil this company is, among other things, you kind of have to wonder, should we let them? Right? Now, the tech companies are going to make all kinds of arguments like they typically do about how many accidents are caused by human beings. But the fact of the matter is that show me the statistics on how many lives are saved by human drivers, right? How many lives are saved because I have a human being behind the wheel and they can tell the difference between a child and a block of wood and stop the car, right? Supposedly our diligent federal, state, and county and city regulators are keeping an eye on these things, but we all know how well the regulatory capture and loopholes there are in our governmental systems. We are a gilded, corrupt democracy. But anyway, as far as Uber being thieves, basically, Google was the first to get into the self-driving car game, or at least the first one I heard of, and certainly the first major player. And they were doing some interesting things back when Google used to be a cool company before they basically turned into Microsoft 2.0. And they hired a guy that used to work for Google who pretty much just carte blanche literally took the code that he wrote for Google, copied it onto a disk, waltzed over to Uber, and said, "Hey guys, want some self-driving cars?" And Uber was like, "Oh, that's cool." And there was a major lawsuit between Uber and Google, which Uber ultimately settled out of court, which is basically, legally speaking, that might be no admission of fault, but to anybody that understands what's going on, Uber totally fucking stole Google's code. Like, just flat out stole it. And Uber has since, not been doing, they're no longer, at least based on what I'm seeing, a major player in the self-driving game. That seems to be a couple of small startups you've never heard of, and Tesla and Google. And I'll be doing a thing on Tesla soon. But the fact of the matter is that Uber is basically really, really creepy, and Lyft isn't that much better. This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. Buy my book, Have Name Will Travel, at Amazon and other markets. RedAnvilCreative.com contains all our podcasts. Copyright 2021.
To fight the forces of evil!